The day the doctor told me there was a tumor nestled in my brain, a ticking clock against my existence, Damian proposed. My mind, already reeling, momentarily wondered if he knew. Did he sense the shadow that had fallen over me? Hesitation flickered within me for no more than 30 seconds, but it was enough. He rose from his knee, the velvet ring box disappearing back into his pocket, his gaze sweeping over me with detached indifference. Parents' wishes, he stated, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth I'd once craved. Forget it if you're not interested. A strange sense of relief washed over me. Of course. This was Damian's way. A cruel jest, mistaking my silence for manipulation, for leveraging his parents to force his hand. This proposal, then, was merely another barb, intended to wound rather than to cherish. Silently, I lowered the hand I hadn't even realized I'd extended. Forcing a smile, I looked up at him. But what if I am interested? I asked, my voice betraying none of the turmoil within. Would you marry me then? He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Words weren't necessary. The answer echoed in the cold air between us. It stung. It always did. Marry me now, I managed, pushing down the burn behind my eyes, a playful defiance lacing my tone, or you might find you've missed your chance. Damian remained unmoved. He shrugged off his coat, draping it over the sofa back, a ghost of a sardonic smile playing on his lips. Are you sure there will be a later for you? His words, as always, were unnervingly prescient. He was right. For me, later was a luxury I could no longer afford. That night, I lay rigid in bed, staring into the darkness, the silence amplifying the unspoken chasm between us. Damian closed his laptop, a sigh escaping him as he rubbed his tired eyes. He slid under the covers, turning his back to me, maintaining the carefully constructed distance we always kept in sleep, a no man's land in the vast expanse of our king-sized bed. 8 years. 8 years together, and he still couldn't bear to truly share a bed with me. But I had always been brazen, shameless in my affection. Even when he recoiled, I would steal closer in the night, pressing against his back, wrapping my arms around his waist, seeking a warmth he rarely offered. Even our first time, it had been a plea, a desperate act of my own making. I was 20. Rain lashed against the windows, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of my heart. The air was heavy, cold, and thick with unspoken desires. I slipped off my cardigan, the silence amplifying the rustle of fabric. Slowly, I moved towards him. And then, I embraced him. He stood motionless, unyielding. Beneath the crisp white shirt, his waist was surprisingly slender, fragile. Unlike me, he radiated heat. Shame and a terrifying exhilaration coursed through me, making me tremble. If he rejected me, I thought, a part of me might simply shatter. I tilted my head back, forcing a smile, though tears blurred my vision. Fear not at me. Fear of the words I dreaded, the cruel dismissals. Shameless, pathetic, disgusting. I was just a girl then, fueled by reckless courage, utterly unprepared for the potential fallout. He stared down at me, his expression cold, distant. I braced myself for the inevitable push, the rejection I felt I deserved. My fingers fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, my legs trembling so violently they threatened to buckle. What are you doing? He finally asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Words caught in my throat. Then, his head dipped, and his lips met mine, a kiss tinged with the bitter salt of my tears. You can't even seduce someone properly, he murmured against my lips, a hint of something I couldn't decipher in his tone, clumsy girl. I tasted the faint tang of alcohol on his breath. His girlfriend had just left him for another man. And I, opportunistic and desperate, had seized my chance, becoming the shadow he couldn't shake. Now, in the inky blackness of our bedroom, I stared up at the faint outline of the chandelier on the ceiling. Perhaps facing the end had finally brought a strange clarity, a detachment. The youthful obsession, the heart-wrenching pursuit of a love that was never truly mine, it all seemed insignificant now, paling in comparison to the simple desire to witness the sunrise. Morning arrived, painting the room in soft hues of dawn. Sunlight brushed against my face, and for a moment, disoriented, I blinked, waiting for my vision to sharpen. The doctor had warned me about the tumor pressing on my optic nerve, the delayed focus, the blurring edges of reality. Damian was propped against the headboard, absorbed in a financial magazine, the crisp pages rustling in the quiet room. Weekends used to be our time for languid mornings in bed, my limbs invariably entwined with his, a subconscious claim in a world where I felt I owned so little of him. Damian glanced down, his eyes flicking over me. Awake? I offered a weak smile. Good morning. His gaze drifted pointedly to my shoulders, then back to his magazine. You slept remarkably still last night, he remarked, his tone laced with an unreadable nuance. I simply smiled again, a silent acknowledgement of the truth he didn't know. He frowned suddenly, his brow furrowing. You were talking in your sleep, he said, his voice sharper now. Muttering nonsense. What was that about? I touched my face, my fingers brushing against dampness. Tears? Had I been crying in my sleep? Anxiety clenched in my chest. Deflecting, I sat up, forcing a lightness into my voice. I dreamt I was in Norway, I announced, my eyes wide, feigning enthusiasm. Surrounded by snow and the northern lights. I really want to go, I continued, my voice softening, a genuine longing creeping in. Could we? Please? My plea hung in the air, vulnerable, tinged with a desperate hope. Damian dismissed it with a wave of his hand, his eyes returning to the magazine. No time. My breath hitched. I swallowed the disappointment, forcing another smile. Oh. Okay then. Perhaps my subdued reaction surprised him. He finally lowered the magazine, turning his head to study me, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in his gaze. March next year, he conceded, his tone still indifferent. This year's schedule is packed. I nodded, a quiet affirmation. March. Maybe that would still be within my reach. But the truth was, the Norway of my dream wasn't a place, but a time. I had dreamt of Damian as he was at 12. He hadn't always been like this. He had once been a good older brother. I was a notoriously picky eater, a child of endless whims and anxieties, constantly fearing my parents' disapproval. He would silently, without a hint of disgust, devour the food I pushed away, rescuing me from scolding. Unlike the Damian of now, who wouldn't even touch a glass I had drunk from. At school, when bullies targeted me, pulling my hair, defacing my notebooks, he was always the first to intervene. He'd stand up for me, fists flying against the tormentors, then smooth things over with the teachers, offering his own pristine notebook to replace the ruined one. I was a timid, withdrawn child, raised by a single mother. Without his unwavering protection, my childhood would have been a far more desolate landscape of bullying and fear. Then, my mother died. Grief shattered me. I wept until I was breathless, convinced I was utterly alone. No one wants me anymore, I sobbed, the words raw and broken. That's not true, he'd countered, his young voice firm, insistent. I repeated my despair, and he repeated his reassurance, a litany against the darkness. I cried all night, and he, despite a throbbing toothache, stayed by my side. His small hand awkwardly patting my back, murmuring comfort until dawn painted the sky. The next day, his cheek was swollen, a testament to his silent vigil. Later, years later, I confessed my affection, offering myself with a clumsy desperation. He met me with coldness, his eyes distant, his words sharp. Pathetic, he'd said, the word a brand against my skin. Monday morning, Damian's spare phone lay forgotten on the kitchen counter. I decided to take it to his office. On the way, a call came in. The contact name on the screen, 11. So intimate. All these years, and he'd never called me anything but my full name. Eleanor. Eleanor. My mother had chosen the name, hoping, perhaps, for a life of peace and tranquility for me. Irony, then. That I was facing a brain tumor before 30, betraying her quiet hope. Cancer, it seemed, was woven into our family tapestry. My mother, my aunt, my great-grandmother, all claimed by it, all young. At the office, Genevieve, his secretary, intercepted me, her demeanor polite, yet distant. Mr. Lancaster is in a meeting, she informed me, her voice coolly professional. Please wait a moment. Genevieve. His classmate from university. His secretary since graduation. She managed every facet of his life, both professional and personal. She spent more hours with him each day than I did. And yes, I resented it. Especially knowing they had been lovers, however briefly, in their university days. A buried shard of jealousy that still pricked me. In our shared social circle, I was painted as the possessive, demanding girlfriend, fiercely guarding Damian, intolerant of any female presence in his orbit. But the truth was, the thought of asking Damian to dismiss Genevieve never even crossed my mind. I remembered too vividly the aftermath of their breakup, the raw, desolate pain etched on his face. He had been a ghost of himself, hollowed out by grief. His eyes, usually so guarded, had held a chilling emptiness as he'd stared at me. "Is this all you know how to do?" he'd asked, his voice hoarse with a despair I had never witnessed before. "Use your parents to manipulate me?" His voice had cracked, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw tears shimmering in his eyes. He cared deeply for her. That day, I had been silenced, stunned by the depth of his emotion. Damian, so reserved, so controlled, had revealed a vulnerability I never knew existed. The old me, the insecure, attention-seeking me, might have waited, stubbornly perched on the edge of the reception sofa, until the meeting concluded, just to stage a possessive display in front of Genevieve. But today, I simply handed the phone to Genevieve. "Please give this to Mr. Lancaster when his meeting finishes," I said, my voice calm, even. With a slight nod in her direction, I turned and walked away. Genevieve's expression held a flicker of surprise, perhaps at my unexpected composure. Damian's parents had retreated to their old family home after retirement, a tranquil haven far from the city's relentless pulse. I visited them monthly, a ritual of dutiful affection. Damian, however, remained stubbornly resistant. "My parents have always preferred you to me," he'd said one evening, his eyes fixed on a contract he was reviewing, his tone casual, dismissive. "Just go. It's enough." My past was a tapestry woven with threads of unspoken anxieties. Born out of wedlock, with a father I'd never known, I had been taken in by Damian's parents after my mother's death. Gratitude, a constant undercurrent in my life, had morphed into a need to please, to earn my place in their world. I'd become adept at performing the role of the perfect daughter, the perfect girlfriend. Eager to please Mrs. Lancaster, to placate Mr. Lancaster, to win Damian's approval, though that felt like chasing a phantom. Damian's strained relationship with his parents was, in part, my unwitting creation. He remained blind to the precariousness of my position, the ever-present awareness that I was, and always would be, the outsider. Years ago, when Damian's parents had vehemently opposed his relationship with Genevieve, it was because they had uncovered her secret, a wealthy benefactor, a kept woman. Damian had been confronted with irrefutable evidence, photographs, whispered rumors. Yet, he had remained unmoved. "She has her reasons," he'd insisted, his voice tight with defensiveness. His mother, exasperated, had turned to me, her words laced with a desperate pragmatism. "If you're going to be drawn to these unsuitable women," she'd declared, her voice sharp with disapproval, "then at least consider Eleanor. She's a decent girl. Respectable." Damian's response had been a brittle laugh, devoid of humor. "If you like her so much," he'd retorted, his eyes cold, "why don't you marry her?" Snapping back to the present, I forced a cheerful tone. "Let's go together," I suggested, trying to coax him. "They'd be so happy." Damian's voice remained unchanged, indifferent. "Whatever makes you happy." I conceded defeat. After a moment, I rose, picking up my bag. "There's food in the kitchen," I said, my voice soft. "Remember to eat." He didn't look up from his papers. "Okay. Drive safe." The drive to their home was 3 hours. I deployed my practiced charm, my words carefully chosen to elicit laughter from his parents. I helped his mother in the garden, loosening soil, scattering radish seeds, erecting supports for the pea seedlings, my hands working diligently to earn their approval, their affection. Sweat beaded on my brow. Unconsciously, I drifted to the stone table in the vegetable garden, collapsing onto it, exhaustion pulling me under. I woke to the muted glow of twilight, a familiar warmth draped over me, his father's jacket. Mosquito bites itched on my arms. The sunset blazed across the sky, a fiery canvas of warmth, a fleeting beauty against the encroaching dusk. After dinner, it was time to leave. His mother pressed my hand, her eyes filled with unspoken concern. "Take care of Damian, Eleanor," she urged, her voice gentle. "I will," I promised, the words catching in my throat. His father added, his gaze thoughtful, and you take care of yourself too, child. You look a little pale lately. Sometimes, it was the smallest kindness that threatened to unravel me. Tears pricked at my eyes. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing a smile. I won't stay up so late anymore, I assured him, my voice wavering slightly. On the drive home, a chilling realization settled upon me. Driving alone, it might soon be something I could no longer do. The headaches were intensifying, the episodes more frequent. Dr. Reed, Alistair, my oncologist, urged hospitalization. The headaches, he explained, would likely escalate, the frequency increasing, the pain unbearable. There was also the risk of seizures, persistent, debilitating. I shook my head, a weary resignation washing over me. If it gets to that point, I said, my voice flat, I'll have already taken matters into my own hands. You know I can't stand being a burden. He studied me for a long moment, his expression grave. Finally, he sighed, a sound of reluctant understanding. Since I couldn't drive, he offered to take me home. In the rearview mirror, Alistair glanced at me, his eyes searching. He still doesn't know? He. Unambiguously, Damian. I shook my head. Haven't figured out how to tell him yet. Silence stretched between us. Then, Alistair spoke, his voice quiet. I can't imagine how he'll react. A hollow laugh escaped me. He'll probably celebrate, I said, the words laced with a bitter humor. Finally free for the rest of his life. Damian's biggest regret, I was certain, was that night in university, the night he'd given in to my desperate advance. Otherwise, he wouldn't be trapped, tethered to me by obligation, by his parents' expectations. Alistair cast a sidelong glance at me, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Do you remember, he began, his voice softening, when I pretended to Damian that you'd drunkenly confessed your feelings for me, and conveniently, my jacket was draped over your shoulders, the same jacket you'd been wearing the night before? He actually believed we'd. You know. He was furious. He was angry, I corrected him, my voice flat, because his parents had forced him to break up with Genevieve. Alistair chuckled, a low, knowing sound. Believe whatever you need to believe, Eleanor. Dusk was deepening. We passed the community sports field, bathed in the fading light. A group of young people, vibrant with energy, were playing basketball. Their shouts and laughter echoing in the evening air. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in my chest, a pang of longing, a ghost of a life unlived. Stop, I said suddenly, my voice sharper than intended. Pull over for a minute. Alistair glanced at me, surprised. I don't want to go home yet, I explained, my voice softening. You used to play basketball, didn't you? I want to watch a game. Me? Alistair hesitated, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Basketball? That was a lifetime ago. I'm more of a ping-pong player these days. But under my persistent persuasion, he relented. Rolling up his sleeves, he reluctantly stepped onto the court, a fish out of water amongst the younger, more agile players. He was tall, lanky, all limbs and awkward grace. After a few hesitant moments, he found his rhythm, his long arms and legs moving with surprising coordination. Then, a perfect three-pointer arced through the air, swishing cleanly through the net. I couldn't help it, a squeal of delight escaped me. Alistair wiped sweat from his brow, a grin spreading across his face as he turned towards me, seeking my approval. In the fading light, at the edge of the court, I saw a familiar figure. Damian. Dressed in his usual crisp shirt and tailored trousers, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his face an impassive mask as he watched the game unfold. I knew, intimately, the story etched onto his left arm, hidden beneath the fabric, a long, jagged scar, a brutal reminder of the car accident. Of the moment he'd shielded me, his body a barrier against the onrushing danger. 20 centimeters of torn flesh, a fractured bone. Steel pins holding him together. The nerve damage, the lingering weakness in his hand, the subtle tremor in his fingers, the price he'd paid. Baseball, basketball, the sports he'd once loved, now forever beyond his reach. Even holding a cup of water steady could be a challenge. That hand. The hand that had once moved with such effortless grace, had shielded me from a shard of glass, a lethal projectile hurtling through the shattered windshield. Guilt, a constant companion, gnawed at me. The game ended. Alistair exchanged high-fives with his teammates, then, breathless and flushed, walked towards me. I offered him my coat. "Let's go," I said, my voice quiet. He feigned offense. "Won the game, and not even a celebratory drink?" "Just my water bottle," I said, offering it to him. He reached for it, his fingers brushing mine. "Fair enough," he said, taking a long swig. Damian was gone. Vanished as silently as he had appeared. "Let's get you that drink," I said to Alistair, trying to shake off the lingering chill that Damian's presence had left behind. When I got home, Damian was already showered and changed, lying in bed in his pajamas, the room plunged into darkness. I showered, slipped into bed beside him. He reached over and flicked off the bedside lamp. Silence descended, thick and heavy, unbroken by a single word. The next day, our carefully planned weekend outing was suddenly expanded. "The company is considering a theme park project," Damian explained, his tone clipped, devoid of warmth. "I'm taking Genevieve along to look at potential sites." I offered no protest. We walked in strained silence for a while. Genevieve, it seemed, had caught a cold. She coughed frequently, a dry, hacking sound. Damian frowned, his gaze fixed on her. "Why didn't you say you were ill?" Genevieve forced a smile, a pale shadow of her usual composure. "I've had a cold for a few days," she admitted, her voice hoarse. "Thought it would pass with medication. But the wind just made it worse." Damian shrugged off his coat, offering it to her. Genevieve wrapped it around herself, a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. You're too kind." The sky was overcast, the wind biting and relentless, whipping at our faces, stinging my cheeks. Damian steered us towards a coffee shop, seeking refuge from the cold. But the cafe was crowded, bustling with lunchtime patrons. Only a table near the entrance remained, exposed to the draft. He gestured for Genevieve to take the wall-side seat, shielding her from the worst of the wind. The cold air, or perhaps the mounting anxiety, triggered a familiar throbbing in my head. A wave of dizziness washed over me, cold sweat prickling my skin. My legs buckled. Instinctively, I reached out, my hand grasping Damian's arm for support. He glanced down at my hand on his sleeve, then up at me, his expression devoid of concern, laced with something akin to irritation. "Are you ill too?" he asked, his voice flat, indifferent. No concern. Just a hint of mockery. I straightened, forcing myself to stand, releasing his arm. "Didn't eat much breakfast," I mumbled, my voice weak. "Low blood sugar, probably." He remained silent, his gaze fixed on Genevieve, who was still coughing. "I'll just go to the restroom," I said, turning away, desperate to escape his cold indifference. He grunted a noncommittal acknowledgement. I turned and fled, the throbbing in my head intensifying with each step. Inhaling deeply, I stumbled towards the restroom, the world tilting precariously. As I reached the restroom door, a sudden warmth trickled down my face. Something wet, something red. A few approaching customers recoiled, their faces registering shock, then concern. A nosebleed. Here, now, in front of them all. Mortification burned through me. I clamped a hand over my nose and mouth, ducking my head, quickening my pace, desperate to reach the sanctuary of the restroom. Locking myself in a stall, I fumbled for my phone, dialing Alistair's number, seeking guidance, desperate for a solution. The phone rang and rang, unanswered. Then, a wave of nausea surged through me, a violent retching that doubled me over. I leaned over the toilet bowl, vomiting until my stomach was empty, my throat raw and burning with acid. Afterwards, the throbbing in my head had miraculously subsided, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. I leaned against the cool tile wall, catching my breath, waiting for the dizziness to pass. I splashed cold water on my face, rinsed my mouth, and slipped out of the coffee shop through a side exit, avoiding the curious stares. When I returned to the table, Genevieve's cough had worsened. Damian was gently patting her back, his gaze fixed on her with an uncharacteristic tenderness. A sharp pang, a familiar ache, tightened in my chest. Jealousy. A bitter, corrosive emotion. I approached the table, placing a small bag in front of Genevieve. Inside, I'd managed to find cough syrup and lozenges at a nearby pharmacy. "I asked at the pharmacy," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "They recommended these. For coughs." Genevieve looked up, surprised. She took the bag, her eyes meeting mine, a flicker of something akin to gratitude in their depths. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said, her voice soft. Damian's attention remained fixed on Genevieve, unwavering, oblivious to my presence, my small offering. "You look pale yourself," Genevieve said, her gaze shifting to me, a genuine concern in her voice. Damian's eyes finally turned to me, a fleeting, perfunctory glance, devoid of warmth, devoid of anything but a cold, detached assessment. I forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing. "Just a bit of a stomach upset," I said, my voice light, dismissive. His voice was flat, indifferent. "We'll finish our drinks," he said, his gaze returning to Genevieve. "Then we'll head back early." I nodded, a silent agreement. In the car, Alistair finally called back. "Sorry," he said, his voice apologetic. "Just got out of a meeting with the head of department. Didn't have my phone." "What's wrong? Is everything all right?" I glanced at Damian in the driver's seat, his profile rigid, unyielding. I lowered my voice, speaking softly. "Just a bit of a stomach bug," I murmured. "Wanted to ask about medication. But it's fine now. Feeling better." A pause. Then, Alistair's voice, low and knowing. "We'll talk later, when you get home," he said, his words a quiet reassurance. A faint smile touched my lips. He always understood. Damian turned to Genevieve. "I'll take you to the hospital," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Get you checked over. Maybe in 4 drip." Genevieve hesitated for a moment, then nodded her agreement. Damian glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his gaze cold, impersonal. "What about you, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice devoid of any real interest. "Want to go to the hospital? Get checked out?" I shook my head, a weary resignation settling over me. "Just drop me off," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll take a cab home." He offered no argument. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone indifferent. I turned my face to the window, watching the blur of the passing scenery. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, a question would surface, unbidden, unwelcome. If Damian knew, if he knew I was dying, would he regret treating me this way? But the answer, I already knew, was a hollow echo in the silence. What did it matter to him? This was my secret, my burden to bear alone. A few minutes later, Damian pulled over at a curb, letting me out. Genevieve offered a small, apologetic smile. The car pulled back into traffic, disappearing into the gray afternoon. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the wind whipping around me, feeling the chilling premonition of a fading echo. Then, I raised my hand, flagging down a taxi. I didn't go home. Instead, I detoured to a convenience store, grabbing a 6-pack of beer. The riverbank called to me, a somber expanse under the vast sky. I sat by the water's edge, the river breeze a cold caress, and drank. Not in a self-destructive frenzy, though. Just half a can. The rest I held, the condensation chilling my fingers. A sudden shiver ran through me, and I impulsively bought a shawl from a roadside clothing stall, a flimsy shield against the encroaching evening chill. Alistair had once asked me, his voice gentle, why I hadn't told my family about my illness. Before my mother succumbed, I had been her sole caregiver. Her final image haunted me, gaunt, withered, her veins collapsed, resisting even the smallest needle. That was my lasting memory of her. A dark cloud clinging to my heart, midnight anxieties punctuated by the desolate, agonizing helplessness of watching a loved one consumed by disease. My death wouldn't be like that. Better they remember me vibrant, whole. Why subject them to futile treatments, to witness my slow, undignified decline? Alistair could tell them later. Tell them I went peacefully, that modern medicine had eased my passing, spared me suffering. I stayed by the river for hours, knees drawn to my chest, dozing fitfully. When I finally checked my phone, the sky was bruised with approaching night. A string of missed calls glared from the screen. I randomly selected one and called back. Damian's voice, sharp with suppressed fury, erupted from the speaker. "I've called you countless times. Why haven't you answered?" He sounded like he wanted to devour me whole. For a moment, I was disoriented, struggling to place myself. Then, a jolt of guilt. Had I missed something important? "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "What's happened?" He was silent for a long, drawn-out beat, his breathing heavy, strained, as if battling to regain control. "Where are you?" he finally demanded, the words clipped. I glanced around, the riverbank stretching out in the twilight. "Loo River Wharf," I replied, the name a soft exhale. "Stay there," he commanded, his voice tightening. "Don't move. I'm coming to get you." I huddled deeper into the shawl, a fragile warmth against the growing cold, and waited, obediently rooted to the spot. Damian arrived sooner than I expected. His car screeched to a halt, and he was striding towards me, his gaze raking over me, searching, assessing. Only when he confirmed I was physically unharmed did his initial panic recede, replaced by a cold composure. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. I opened my mouth to answer, but a violent sneeze ripped through me, cutting off my words. His expression darkened. Without a word, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around me, a forceful gesture. I instinctively recoiled. This coat. It had been draped over Genevieve's shoulders just hours ago. Faintly, I caught the lingering scent of her perfume, a delicate floral note that stung like a hidden barb. Trailing behind him, I surreptitiously slipped the coat off, letting it dangle from my hand. Damian, unlocking the car door, turned abruptly, his brow furrowing as he registered my discarded coat. "What now?" he demanded, his voice laced with impatience. Quietly, I said, "Genevieve wore it." "She wore it. I didn't want it." Call it childish, petty. But on the precipice of oblivion, did such trivialities even matter? Was there still a need for such meticulous composure? "Nonsense," he snapped, grabbing the coat and forcefully draping it back over my shoulders. But the tension in his brow eased slightly. "You'll wear it. You think you're not ill enough already?" Inside the car, he cranked up the heater. "It's too hot," I mumbled, the warmth stifling. "Serves you right," he retorted, but there was a strange undercurrent in his voice, something less harsh, almost tender. Since the accident, Damian's driving had become meticulously cautious. The 5-kilometer journey stretched into a 15-minute crawl. As we reached the apartment door, he suddenly seized my hand, his head dipping to inhale, catching the faint lingering scent of beer. "How much did you drink?" "1 can," I insisted, my voice barely above a whisper. He clearly didn't believe me. I tried to elaborate, to explain, but another sneeze, then another, erupted, a chain reaction that shook my entire body. He placed a hand on my forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Feverish?" Perhaps the force of the sneezes had dislodged something. A warm trickle ran down my nose. Damian's expression shifted, alarm flickering in his eyes. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, pressing a hand to my nose. Probably just a bit of a cold." But the blood was gushing now, a crimson tide threatening to overwhelm. Damian's face paled. He tilted my head back, pinching my nostrils, and hurried into the bedroom, returning moments later with medical cotton balls. He gently, meticulously, packed them into my nostrils, his movements precise, careful. The bleeding gradually subsided. My face, my neck, were sticky with drying blood. Damian dampened a towel with warm water and began to gently cleanse my skin. When he reached my chest, his hand faltered for a fleeting moment. I tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a dark stain, the size of a coin, on the crisp fabric. "You got blood on you," I murmured, my voice weak. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, his gaze fixed on my face, his brow furrowing again. "A sneeze, and your nose bleeds. Are you made of porcelain?" I nodded, readily agreeing. "I am rather delicate, yes." It was the truth, after all. He studied me, his gaze lingering. "You've lost weight, haven't you?" He noticed. He still remembered my weight. Damian disappeared into the kitchen, emerging shortly with a steaming bowl of noodles, fragrant with garlic and soy. He stood over me, silent and watchful, until I'd consumed every last strand. It had been a long time since I'd felt this full. My stomach stretched, distended, a heavy, unfamiliar sensation. He fetched my pajamas, kneeling to untie my shoes, his movements slow, deliberate. His hair fell forward, obscuring his eyes, lending his features a fleeting softness, a gentle patience. For a fleeting moment, the years seemed to melt away. I was transported back to a time before, a time when he had cared, had nurtured. Back then, my picky eating habits had finally exhausted his patience. He had, with a firm hand, corrected my palate, broadening my tastes, forcing me to eat what was good for me. So many questions lingered, unspoken, unanswered. Why, with his stellar academic record, had he chosen to stay at our local university, a mediocre institution compared to the national elite he could have accessed? Had his explanation, wanting to escape his family's scrutiny, been the whole truth? Or had it been something more, something unspoken? Had he feared leaving me alone, vulnerable, to navigate the daunting world of university life without his protection? But the words remained trapped in my throat, unuttered. Damian's phone rang. He rose, moving a few steps away, his voice softening, becoming almost gentle. Yes, she's been found, he murmured into the phone, his tone soothing. Some things, it seemed, were predetermined, etched into the fabric of fate. Had he not stayed, had he gone to a different university, he wouldn't have met Genevieve. Though their paths had diverged, pulled apart by external pressures, after all these years, their connection remained, an undeniable undercurrent in the currents of their lives. Damian, I thought, a silent plea echoing in the stillness of the room. My time is running out. Just, stay with me a little longer. See me through this. Then, you'll be free. My birthday was just a month away. The relentless ache in my body was intensifying, a constant, gnawing presence. Pain medication, even in escalating doses, offered only fleeting respite. Alistair, his voice somber, confirmed my fears, the prognosis was grim. I clung to Damian, a desperate, childlike insistence rising within me. Take me to see the northern lights, I pleaded, my voice a thin thread of desperation. Please? We agreed, next year, he said, his tone weary, laced with impatience. But I can't wait, I whispered, the words a raw confession of my mortality. Don't you understand? Don't you know what the aurora borealis symbolizes? Luck. Fortune. Those who witness it are blessed with a lifetime of happiness. A lifetime. A cruel jest in my case. My persistent nagging finally wore down his resistance. Fine, he conceded, the word grudging, devoid of enthusiasm. Really? My eyes widened, a spark of fragile hope igniting within me. Yes, he affirmed, his voice flat. A surge of exhilaration, however fleeting, coursed through me. I threw my arms around his neck, clinging tightly, pressing a kiss to the tip of his nose, a spontaneous burst of affection. Damian stiffened momentarily, his muscles locking, but he didn't pull away. A subtle shift had occurred in our dynamic. A fragile truce, perhaps. An unspoken understanding. The most tangible manifestation of this shift was a change in Damian himself. He became fiercer. Though our intimacy had never been infrequent, lately, it had become more intense, more demanding, almost frantic. As if he were trying to, what? Burn away the distance between us? Consume me entirely? Setting aside the tangled web of our past, the unresolved tensions, I found myself cherishing these fleeting moments. If only the shadows of Genevieve, of unspoken resentments, could be banished. Beneath the layers of coldness and indifference, there was still a flicker of something brotherly, protective. Life, as always, was a tapestry woven with threads of irony and unexpected turns. After enduring so much, I was finally nearing my birthday. The day I had desperately clung to, a fragile beacon in the encroaching darkness. That day, I ventured out, a fragile mission to gather supplies for our, still tentative, trip to Norway. But on the street, the familiar, searing headache struck, blinding, incapacitating. A delivery scooter, veering around a corner, collided with me. I crumpled to the ground, a broken doll, the world dissolving into a kaleidoscope of pain. My vision blurred, white-hot agony lancing through my skull. The scooter driver, a young man, his face etched with panic, fumbled for his phone, babbling about ambulances. I waved him away, my voice a strangled whisper, and dialed Alistair's number. He was supposed to be off duty today. Alistair arrived swiftly, a whirlwind of efficiency and calm amidst my unraveling. He scooped me up from the pavement, cradling me like a child, easing me into his car. Then, a small vial, a sharp sting, and the blessed oblivion of sedation. As the pain receded, leaving a dull ache in its wake, a morbid humor surfaced. When I die, I murmured to Alistair, my voice slurred, make sure you get half my estate. You're a better boyfriend than my actual boyfriend. He shot me a weary glare, his brow furrowed with concern. Who wants your estate? Then what do you want? I persisted, my voice childishly petulant. I don't have much else to offer. He paused, considering, then a faint smile touched his lips. Cook me a meal, he said, his voice softening. Truth be told, I think I initially pursued you because your cooking was too damn good. Oh. All those years of cooking for Damian, and it hadn't earned me his love. We stopped at the market, a mundane task imbued with a strange poignancy. With a sense of quiet gratitude, I prepared to pour my remaining energy into this. One last act of care. Alistair, initially lounging against the kitchen doorframe, watching me with amusement, was soon conscripted into sous chef duty. Midway through preparing the meal, Damian called. What's going on? His voice, tight with suppressed anxiety. Someone at the office said they saw you get hit by a scooter on the street? I froze, momentarily stunned. How had he found out so quickly? Just a little accident, I mumbled, downplaying it. Nothing serious. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Where are you? He demanded, his voice hardening. Alistair, deftly deveining shrimp, held out the bowl to me. Shrimp's ready, he announced. Heads and shells removed. Though, honestly, shrimp already peeled would have been far less hassle. Damian's line went silent. Forced to clarify, I said, Alistair helped me. I'm at his place, cooking him dinner. I see. His voice was flat, cold. Then, abruptly, he hung up. Alistair and I exchanged a glance. He shrugged, a gesture of helpless understanding. That evening, Damian returned late. I rushed to greet him, a forced cheerfulness in my step, offering him a mug of warmed milk. When are we going to Norway? I asked, my voice bright, brittle. I need to book the tickets. Damian looked up at me, his gaze unreadable. He didn't take the milk. He didn't speak. In the heavy silence that descended, a cold premonition settled in my stomach. And then, the words came, flat, devoid of emotion. I'm sorry, Eleanor. A complex project in the UK. We've been awarded the contract. It requires my on-site presence. From start to finish. At least 6 months. My fingers tightened around the ceramic mug, the warmth leaching away, leaving a chill that mirrored the ice spreading through my veins. In another life, in a life that wasn't slipping through my fingers, I would have understood. Work was paramount. Career first. A principle I had always respected, even when my own desires clashed with his professional demands. I might be impulsive, demanding, difficult. But I had never interfered with his work. Could it be postponed? I stammered, the question laced with a desperate, almost pleading note. Norway, we wouldn't be gone for long. Perhaps my unexpected persistence surprised him. He finally met my gaze, a flicker of something, pity? In his eyes. Next year, he said, his voice softening slightly. We can go next year. Stay as long as you want. After a long silence, I managed a choked, okay. Next year. But there wouldn't be a next year. A flicker of guilt, perhaps, softened his usual reserve. Later, in bed, my back turned to him, Damian's arms encircled me from behind, his lips tracing soft kisses along my neck, my shoulder. I remained unresponsive, a statue of ice. He didn't protest, didn't push. He simply continued, his kisses. Deepening, lingering, tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my ear, even each individual finger, as if memorizing the topography of my skin. A frantic, almost desperate tenderness. 5 months of separation looming, and he seemed determined to condense a lifetime of intimacy into one night. The next morning, he packed a small suitcase. Genevieve waited outside, the car idling in the driveway. Damian turned to me, a perfunctory farewell. I'll come back when I can, he said, the words rote, devoid of conviction. Then, he turned to leave. Don't you want to hug me goodbye? I asked, the words barely audible, a whisper of vulnerability. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then leaned in, a brief, impersonal embrace. Genevieve leaned forward from the car window. Mr. Lancaster, she called, her voice politely impatient, we should leave now. Damian froze, his movements halting. Of course. Outward displays of affection were not part of our repertoire, not in public, not in front of Genevieve. He glanced at me, a fleeting, unreadable expression in his eyes. I'll be back, he repeated, the words a hollow echo. Then, he turned and walked towards Genevieve, towards the waiting car, towards a life that didn't include me. I started counting, a familiar, childish habit. 1 step. 2 steps. 3 steps, 10 steps. He didn't look back. I had always yearned for that backward glance, a single fleeting moment of regret, of longing. Proof, however small, that he might miss me, that I might matter, even a little. But this time, as always, there was nothing. I slept for a long time. Waking in the pre-dawn hours, the city hushed, still. A message from Damian blinked on my phone screen, a brief, perfunctory update that he had arrived in the UK safely. I didn't reply. Sleep eluded me. Knees drawn to my chest, I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence amplifying the hollowness within me. It was almost a relief. I hadn't wanted him to know about my illness, after all. His absence, his departure, ensured he wouldn't witness my death. In the hazy stillness of the early morning, memories surfaced, fragments of the past. When I was a child, my health was fragile, riddled with allergies, plagued by rhinitis. Hypersensitive to dust. On cleaning duty days at school, he would always appear in our classroom, silently sweeping the floors, erasing the blackboard in my stead. In winter, when I slipped and fell on the ice, he would pull off his gloves and place them on my frozen hands, then carry me home on his back. When I was sick with a fever, my throat raw with pain, and no adults were home, he would patiently spoon-feed me cooled porridge, each spoonful a silent act of care. And the car accident. If not for his body shielding mine, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be anywhere. Each instance of his coldness, his indifference, seemed to be counterbalanced by these buried acts of kindness. A delicate, precarious equilibrium, tilting back and forth, year after year, act after act. And still, I loved him. Despite everything. Because some memories, some acts of love, required a lifetime of indifference to erase. And his kindnesses, those childhood acts of devotion, remained stubbornly indelible. Barefoot, I wandered into Damian's study. A room he rarely allowed me to enter, a sanctuary of his solitude. In a dusty corner of the bookshelf, I discovered a sketchbook. Damian had once loved to draw. Sketches of all kinds filled the pages, and then, tucked amidst them, a single line of childish handwriting. I know Eleanor is pitiful because she has no mother, but I don't like her. Hesitantly, I turned the page. More childish scrawl. Since she came to live with us, Mom and Dad only have eyes for her. When we drive anywhere, she gets carsick, so Mom holds her the whole time. She doesn't like the food I like. So now Mom and Dad only make food she likes. When I get sick, no one even notices. A pang of guilt constricted my chest. My arrival had cast such a long shadow over his childhood, stealing his parents' attention, their affection. He had been just a child then, displaced, overlooked. Why should he have been magnanimous? The entries became more frequent, more detailed. She found a kitten in the rain. It died. She cried and cried. I hugged her. She hugged me back really tight. Her tears and snot got all over me. Gross. Mom and Dad forgot my birthday. But she didn't. She told the whole class, even got the teacher to make everyone sing happy birthday to me. I didn't look up the whole time. So embarrassing. I told her not to call me brother. She doesn't listen. I'm not her brother. Does being her brother mean I have to always let her have her way? That's what Mom and Dad say. Does she call every boy brother? The sketchbook was mostly drawings, punctuated by these brief, revealing journal entries. Today, I overheard her talking to the kitten's grave. She said, if I don't try to please him, I'm afraid Uncle and Aunt will send me away. That made me feel. I don't know. Sad, maybe? Tears pricked at my eyes. As a child, all I had wanted was to belong, to be part of their family, to be his family. My affection for Damian had been tangled with that desperate longing. A yearning for home, for belonging. But that didn't negate the genuine affection, the undeniable love I felt for him. Damian's journal entries became sparser as he grew older, adulthood silencing his childish confidences. On the last page, just one sentence: "She seems to think I was drunk that night." Stupid girl. Men don't get drunk. The pages were brittle, stuck together with age. Tearing them apart, I found one last entry, hidden on the second-to-last page. "Genevieve is a lot like me. I see so much of myself in her. Even the stains on her soul are the same as mine. Maybe I could make her my girlfriend." A cold jolt went through me. So, in the end, he had recognized Genevieve as his true soulmate. My childhood memories, it seemed, were skewed, incomplete, viewed through the prism of my own desperate need for love. And I had been an obstacle in his path, a shadow across his life. I picked up a pen, and on the back cover of the sketchbook, I wrote 3 words. "I'm sorry, Damian." The headache returned, a relentless pounding that resonated through my entire being. Pain, a visceral, all-consuming entity. Was the pain medication losing its efficacy? I gazed at my reflection in the mirror. Truthfully, I was a sorry sight. The last vestiges of baby fat had vanished, leaving my face gaunt, hollowed out. Damian didn't care for the cute younger sister look. Perhaps he would find this version of me more palatable? More like a distant aunt, perhaps. As pain convulsed through me, blurring the edges of consciousness, an overwhelming urge to call Damian consumed me. My fingers hovered over his number on my phone screen. But in the end, I didn't press call. I was a selfish creature, riddled with dark, hidden desires. I knew Damian didn't love me, yet I had clung to him, manipulated him, weaponized obligation. This time, though, I would let him go. On my birthday, Damian called repeatedly. The phone screen illuminated, then dimmed, illuminated again, a silent, persistent plea. Finally, I answered. "Why did you take so long to answer?" His voice, tinged with static, a distant echo of concern. "Asleep," I murmured, my voice weak. "Did you eat cake?" he asked, the question oddly tender. I nodded, a silent lie. "Yes." "Did Mom and Dad celebrate with you?" I couldn't bear to let his parents see me like this. I had spun a tale of impulsive travel, a sudden urge to see the world, a journey of indefinite duration. A convenient, cowardly escape. "No," I said, forcing a laugh, a brittle, hollow sound. "Celebrated with friends." A beat of silence. Then, Alistair? He was, after all, the closest friend I had maintained throughout the years. "Yes," I affirmed, the lie solidifying. "He bought the cake. But he got the age wrong, the idiot. Said I was getting older, 1 year counting as 2, annoying me no end." A fabricated lightness in my voice, a performance of normalcy. In truth, I hadn't seen Alistair in weeks. Damian just hummed an acknowledgement. "I've been having these stomach pains lately," I continued, pushing the lie further, weaving a tapestry of fabricated ailments. "And chest pains too. Agonizing. Rolling on the floor kind of pain." A clumsy attempt at playful complaint, but my voice cracked, betraying the fragility beneath the forced levity. "Come home soon, okay? I want to see you." Hadn't I learned the story of the boy who cried wolf? Years ago, when Damian and Genevieve had planned an overseas business trip, I demanded to go too. Denied, I'd resorted to threats, a melodramatic performance of self-destruction. The night before their departure, a message: "If you leave without me, I won't live." Empty words, a childish manipulation. But Damian had believed me. He had rushed back, frantic, to find me sitting cross-legged on the floor, a blunt butter knife held theatrically to my wrist. His initial panic had instantly morphed into cold fury. After that, any complaint of illness, any plea for attention, fell on deaf ears, met with weary impatience. The more I begged him to return, the more resolutely he would stay away. A bitter lesson learned. I knew the game. Making him love me had been an impossible feat, 20 years of futile effort. But making him resent me, that was an art I had mastered. And perhaps, if he resented me enough, when news of my death reached him, the grief would be less. If he grieved at all. A cold dismissal echoed down the line. "I'll be back when my work is finished." Then, the line went dead. How to make him love me, an unsolvable equation. But how to make him hate me? Effortless. A cruel paradox. Perhaps a final, twisted act of love. To lessen the sting of my absence. If my absence would sting at all. A month later, I found myself in a dimly lit bar, the melancholic strains of live music washing over the room. The next table over, a boisterous group, Damian's friends. A mix of men and women. Huddled in a dark corner, a baseball cap pulled low over my face, shrouded in black clothing, I remained unnoticed, a ghost in the periphery. Their conversation drifted to me, snippets of gossip, fragments of speculation. Damian. He wanted to end things. Too much time, too much strain. They were both exhausted, weary of the charade. A strange sense of calm settled over me. It was time. Time to dismantle the remnants of our shared life. I returned home and began to systematically pack. Clothes, shoes, toiletries, the gaudy trinkets I had stubbornly introduced into his minimalist space, every trace of my presence, meticulously removed. So that when his new girlfriend moved in, she wouldn't stumble upon lingering ghosts, wouldn't find echoes of a past she hadn't shared. The packed boxes, mostly destined for the dump, some for a fleeting second life in the second-hand market. Even the wedding photos, taken on a whim during a family trip abroad, a whimsical memento cherished by his parents too, those, too, had to go. Once treasured, proudly displayed, now unsellable, disposable. Before leaving, I took one last look around the apartment. Clean. Sterile. Devoid of my essence. Almost. One final object remained. A large, plush brown bear, perched on the living room sofa. Chosen because, in its stoic stillness, it had always reminded me of Damian. I pinned a small note to its paw. Bear for Genevieve. How deep was Damian's affection for Genevieve? I remembered Genevieve once mentioning, her voice wistful, how she missed the fireworks of her childhood, those fleeting bursts of light that embodied the purest, most innocent hopes. The car accident. The three of us crammed into my car, Damian in the passenger seat, Genevieve behind me. When the out-of-control truck slammed into us, Damian had instinctively shielded me from the flying debris. But the twisted metal of the car trapped me, my legs pinned beneath the steering column, shards of glass lacerating my thighs, blood blooming crimson against the denim. A strange detachment descended, a numbing stillness. Pain registered, but distantly, muted. From the back seat, Genevieve's cries of pain pierced the silence. Damian, ignoring his fractured arm, had scrambled out of the wreckage. Rushing to her side, wrenching open her door, lifting her into his arms. Only then, his primary concern addressed, had he turned back to me. When had Damian returned from the UK? Why hadn't he told me he was back? Seeing him emerge from a taxi at the entrance to our complex. I froze, a deer caught in headlights, panic seizing me, a desperate urge to vanish, to become invisible. He mustn't see me like this. Perhaps sensing my gaze, a prickling awareness, he turned, his eyes scanning the street, locking onto my retreating figure. I whirled around, a clumsy, undignified retreat, quickening my pace, desperate to escape. I had rented a small apartment nearby, a temporary refuge. Safe within its bare walls, I finally exhaled, a ragged sigh of relief. Moments later, Damian's call pierced the fragile quiet. He must have returned home, found the apartment empty, my absence a gaping void. Summoning a semblance of composure, I answered. Hello? His voice, cold, sharp, cut through the air. Where are you? I didn't answer. He repeated the question, a threat of menace tightening his tone. Where are you? My mind raced, scrambling for a plausible lie. I went traveling, I stammered, the excuse flimsy, unconvincing even to my own ears. A harsh laugh, devoid of humor. Traveling? And you took all your belongings with you? I thought we'd been robbed. What is the meaning of this, Eleanor? I thought I'd move out, I mumbled, the words barely audible. A sharp intake of breath. Then, his voice, dangerously low, vibrating with barely contained rage. I'll ask you one more time, Eleanor. Where are you? Taking a deep breath, steeling myself for the inevitable fallout, I spoke the words that would finally sever the thread, the words that would set us both free. Let's break up, Damian. Silence. A vast, echoing silence. Then, I hung up. 2 nights later, under the cloak of darkness, I crept back to the villa. The plush brown bear, the one intended for Genevieve, lay discarded in the yard, abandoned to the elements. Soaked by rain, streaked with dirt, a pathetic, unwanted offering. His temper, I knew, was volatile. My actions, my departure, my final, defiant act of leaving the bear, he wouldn't tolerate such blatant disrespect. I stroked the bear's damp ear, then, with a pang of something akin to pity, I picked it up, cradling its sodden bulk in my arms. Clumsy, absurd. Shoving it into the taxi's back seat was a struggle, a comical scene played out in the dead of night. A sliver of selfish hope lingered. Perhaps, in the years to come, he and Genevieve might occasionally glance at the bear, a silent, faded reminder of me. Or perhaps, better yet, he would simply forget I had ever existed. If I die, I wondered, a morbid curiosity stirring within me, will Damian miss my cooking? Will he miss my voice? Will he miss me, even a little, even just enough to be annoyed by my absence? Will he even notice I'm gone? My weight was plummeting. I was rapidly approaching the undignified state Alistair had described, the final, gruesome decline. Euthanasia was illegal in this country, a bitter irony. Switzerland, then? But the journey, the ordeal of travel, seemed insurmountable in my weakened state. Alistair, his eyes shadowed with compassion, offered to take me. To escort me to that final, irreversible threshold. I tilted my head, studying him. Wouldn't that be too cruel for you? I asked, my voice soft. To be the one to send me off? The nightmares that would surely follow him. After days of agonizing contemplation, a different path emerged. The sea. The vast, indifferent ocean. Rivers, lakes, streams, Damian preferred them all. He loved the gentle currents of creeks, the wide expanse of rivers, the tranquil stillness of lakes. But the sea. The ocean's mysterious depths, its boundless horizons, its untamed power, it held no appeal for him. He was, in essence, a man of quiet, predictable tastes. And so, the sea it would be. To die in a place he disliked. A final, perhaps petty, act of defiance. To spare him the inconvenience of my memory haunting his preferred landscapes. Though Alistair had refused it, I still bequeathed half my meager estate to him in my will. As a friend, as a doctor, his kindness had been boundless, undeserved. And I had so little to offer in return. Shame washed over me. My wealth was paltry. I had intended to record a video message for his parents, for Aunt and Uncle Lancaster. But seeing my reflection, my ravaged face, I abandoned the idea. Instead, a letter. A letter of gratitude. A lifetime of unspoken longing, finally articulated. Mom. Dad. The words, written in trembling script, a quiet plea for forgiveness. The sea wind held, a mournful, desolate cry. On social media, a new image flickered into existence. Damian and Genevieve. Fireworks. Genevieve's childhood wish, finally realized. Explosions of color painting the night. Sky, ephemeral bursts of brilliance, cascading stars dissolving into the darkness. A fleeting spectacle of vibrant life, then nothing. A poignant, heartbreaking metaphor. I placed my phone on a nearby rock, the screen glowing with their distant joy. Then, I stepped into the churning water, into the cold, indifferent embrace of the sea.